Hello, I'm Chris McCarthy from the American Chemical Society. Welcome to this media briefing from ACS Spring 2022. Our eyes may be our windows on the world, but our fingertips put us in touch with it. To recreate this tactile sense, current technology relies on tiny motors and electricity, but the bumps and buzzes they generate are not that good at mimicking the real thing. So now scientists are reporting at the ACS meeting evidence that our skin can perceive subtle differences in chemistry, findings they hope could provide the basis for a new way to control touch and better integrate it into applications such as virtual reality. We're joined today by Dr. Charles Dhong from the University of Delaware. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So as I was reading about your research, I realized like most of us go through the world picking up objects and not really thinking about what's happening on a molecular level or the chemical makeup of the things we're holding. But your research shows that those things contribute a great deal of information to the sense of touch and how we perceive the world around us. Could you tell a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. So the way we kind of got started in this field is, I mean, if you look at like the phone in your pocket, it's really great at recreating sound, recreating visual stimuli, like you can stream a video. But for the most part, it kind of just buzzes or vibrates. So we're wondering why is that? Why is there this technological limitation behind controlling touch when, if you go into a store and you're deciding to buy some clothing, one of the things is you get that tactile feedback. It's a big part of our lives in terms of you wake up, you look for your clothes. It's also, if you have low vision or blindness, a really critical source of information. So we're really curious about why is there this big technological gap when it does seem like it would be really nice in our lives. So we kind of took this kind of mechanics approach to it, right? So when you touch an object, it's this really complex generation of friction. All these little forces are happening across your finger, even when you're touching a really simple object. And all that different forces across your finger are giving rise to a tactile sensation. So we're wondering, okay, if we think that that's how touch works, then how can we use current tools to control that? If the bumps and vibrations have only taken us so far, can we turn to chemistry to develop kind of new approaches to create tactile sensations?
And so what do you think is important about this in terms of, why it's an important thing for us to know?
Yeah, so one of the things is, I mean, most of us go through our lives touching objects, right? It's a very basic human sense and the way we perceive our environment. I think there's other applications where it's really important, right? If we look at kind of the technologies available to people with low vision and blindness, they don't have the same kind of information density that a visual graphic might have. So how can we bring that kind of closer? How can we make, so I'm a scientist, I use plots and graphs frequently. And a lot of times you have a lot of data packed onto that plot. So if you try to make that into a tactile version, you just can't put as much information in there. So there's this really basic part of how does touch work? If you're losing your sense of touch, why is that? Or can we do any kind of strategies to mitigate that? But also if you have low vision and blindness, can we develop kind of better technologies to kind of close the gap between STEM education, making abstract concepts a little more accessible. So those are some of the ideas that motivate us.
Great. So how did you go about investigating this?
Yeah. So actually, my prior work was kind of looking at, maybe you've heard of like geckos attaching onto surfaces. That was kind of a big topic for a while. So kind of trying to understand what are the complex mechanical forces happening at a patterned interface. And so what I mean by that is that your finger is actually this really complex object, right? So if you take a look at your finger, you have ridges on it. So it's not the smooth interface. Your finger is pretty soft, so it's deformable. It also has a pretty heterogeneous structure in terms of the surface chemistry. So the outside layer is slightly wetting, it's slightly glassy. So even getting a basic handle on what are the mechanical forces going into the finger is pretty challenging. So our approaches are to kind of break down the system, right? The finger is complex. We can't really change out what someone's finger is. So why don't we try and control the surface they're touching? So what we did is we used silicon wafers, we used surface monolayers, and those are a pretty well-established system. Silicon wafers are very, very smooth. Surface monolayers have reliable chemistries, and they deposit in pretty well-known in a well-known fashion. So we try to kind of break it down into what are the very basic things that allow someone to perceive differences in a surface, and how small can you go?
Yeah, that was one of the things I thought was really interesting. It's just how subtle these differences that people can perceive are. And I think another thing that your research found is that it's not just a physical, it's a chemical. The chemical differences are noticeable, even very slight chemical differences. Could you talk a little bit more about that subtlety?
Yeah, definitely. So I think kind of to relate this to everyday life, if you have a dishwasher and let's say you have a glass and you've used it, it feels a certain way. You put it into your dishwasher, it cleans it out, and then when you take it out, it almost bites when you hold it. So the glass is the same, right, in most of its physical attributes, but it's that thin surface coating and surface chemistry that's affecting how it feels. So some of these small differences, what we're saying is that kind of the traditional approach is, right, just to use like maybe a really thin fiber and to poke across your finger and say as smaller and smaller fibers, maybe that has something to do with the limits with what you can feel. But as we showed, by using these kind of subtle differences in chemistry, we show that really, really small phenomena can actually give rise to big changes, enough that you can feel with your finger. So in this approach, what we said is we have these surface monolayers. You can easily change their chemistry. So if you have them in a more ordered state, they're kind of more like a solid. So your finger is able to somewhat more easily glide on it. But if they're either short or they don't have that amine functionalization, then they're far apart and they're almost liquid-like. So your finger kind of gets caught up in there and it generates more friction. So even though we show that it's a single atom substitution, we're really talking about multiple length scales of phenomena here. We're talking about that small change on the chemical structure gives rise to the difference in intermolecular forces, which gives rise to these changes in friction, which you ultimately perceive.
Interesting. So in addition, you also looked at the impact of crystallinity. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so another thing we're looking into right now is into polymer systems. So silanes are used widely, but polymers are almost in every single product that we use. And they're also a big area that a lot of people are working with. So we thought that maybe if we can adapt some of our findings in silanes and start to develop them more towards polymers, we could start to see more widespread adoption in a format that people and industry is more familiar with. So in the polymers, there's a somewhat similar kind of like parallel mechanism in this idea of ordering that, but in the case of polymer, you could describe this more as amorphous versus crystalline, which is kind of a different but similar way of saying disordered and ordered in the silanes. So what we're finding is that even these subtle changes in crystallinity, so we're talking about molecules that have the same molecular weight, same structure, but they have different stereochemistry, and we're using different processing conditions. So we found that people can actually tell differences in crystallinity in polymer films as well. And again, it's kind of getting away from this idea of, okay, what's the smallest thing you can feel? Maybe it's a millimeter, maybe it's half a millimeter. We're saying it's, at that molecular level, those differences kind of don't mean as much. So it's really about the structure of the films being created.
So how could this knowledge then be used to improve technology?
Yeah, definitely. So applications we see are maybe we can combine this with existing tactile aids. Maybe we can make them higher contrast. If we think about virtual reality applications, there's still this limitation, the number of different tactile sensations that these bumps or buzzers can make. So maybe some of our findings here will then be adapted to kind of new systems that you might put into, like, let's say a glove, and then it can start to feel different just through electrical control. We're trying to bridge that gap between what we experience in everyday environments when we're touching objects versus kind of what a current haptic device can create.
So with these different kinds of differences, the physical and the chemical, are there advantages and disadvantages to them in terms of how you would apply that?
Yeah, so I think one of the disadvantages with the chemical side is that it's not well established yet. And I guess that's exciting for us because there's a lot of work to do. But it's not obvious that a certain single atom substitution would lead to a change. And what we're saying is that doesn't happen all the time. You really have to have the right system for that subtle change to impact touch. So I think that kind of challenge between connecting chemical structure to human sensation is a multi-length scale problem. So because that's not as well established, I think that makes it a little harder. Again, a little more exciting for us. Physical features are robust. They're strong. If you make a bump on a surface, you're likely to be able to feel it. There's lots of materials we tested that you can't feel them. And we didn't predict that you can feel them. I mean, we weren't supposed to be able to feel them. But still, trying to decide which systems to use is not as obvious.
What are the next steps for your research?
Yeah, so we're really interested, again, in this virtual reality so we can make switchable systems. We really want to kind of build a fundamental basis for what kinds of changes are necessary at the molecular scale to create tactile sensations. We'd like to kind of beef up our predictions kind of between, if you have a list of materials, which ones are worth testing with humans. It takes a lot of time to test with humans. So ideally you can narrow down your selection. So some predictions between structure and human performance. And there's also basic aspects of touch that we didn't talk about, like what are these sensations that people are feeling? A lot of our tests, we're trying to keep it as simple as possible on the human side. So we're just saying, can you feel it or can you not feel it? But in some of our other work, we're saying there are actually these fundamental parts of touch that you can decompose touch and potentially decompose touch into kind of more basic units. So one of the units we found is softness, that multiple people will agree upon kind of this one object should be softer than the next, and you'll have this consistent ordering if I give you multiple samples. So kind of that basic, how does touch work? What is touch perception? We're also trying to get behind that.
Great. So what would you want viewers to take away from this research?
Yeah, I guess, yeah, that's a big question. I guess in general is that, touch is exciting. It's a part of everyday life. The fact that we can feel so many things in our everyday life, yet we can't recreate them in the lab using a synthetic system, means a lot about how even something that we experience every day, we don't understand a lot about. So I would want viewers to be kind of motivated to say, like, what is it about our everyday environment, and just being curious. When you're touching something, it's so complex that you're able to do it hundreds of times a day. For viewers coming kind of more from a chemistry background, I'd be excited if, it'd be great if they were starting to get excited. How can my materials or my system be used for touch? Maybe it wasn't a very good solar cell, but it might be actually very good for controlling the sense of touch. So we think it's exciting for a lot of people working in polymers or in chemistry to kind of start to develop materials to control touch. So these types of tactile materials, maybe we can start to lay some of the groundwork of design rules. Something like that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Charles, for sharing your research with us. Be sure to check out our other media briefings for ACS Spring 2022, which will be posted throughout the meeting at www.acs.org/ACS Spring 2022 briefings. Thank you.